My wife cheated with my business partner and demanded half my company in the divorce. My wife Jenna and my business partner Kyle had been sleeping together for 8 months before I found out. They weren't even careful about it. Kyle would come to dinner at our house and they'd exchange these looks while I talked about quarterly projections. Jenna would say she was visiting her sister, but her sister would call asking where she was. Kyle would miss important meetings because he was supposedly sick, but then Jenna would have mysterious bruises on her neck the next day. When I finally confronted them, they didn't deny it. Jenna actually smiled and said, "Kyle appreciates me in ways you never could. You only care about that stupid company." Kyle just shrugged and said, "Business is business, personal is personal. You should understand that." They'd already planned everything out. Jenna had been documenting every late night I worked, every missed dinner, every vacation I postponed for the company. She'd been building a case that I was an absent husband who prioritized work over marriage. Her lawyer said she deserved compensation for supporting my career while sacrificing her own. She'd been a receptionist when we met. Kyle backed her up, testified that I was impossible to work with and emotionally unavailable. He said the affair only happened because Jenna was so lonely and desperate for attention. The judge ate it up. Jenna got the house, alimony, and most importantly, she demanded half of my shares in the company. "I helped build that business," she told the court. "I deserve my fair share of what we created together." She'd never worked a single day at the company, but her lawyer argued that her emotional support and household management allowed me to focus on building the business. The judge agreed. The company was valued at $2 million on paper. Jenna walked away with 50% ownership. She was so proud of herself. She posted constantly about being a successful businesswoman and entrepreneur. "Finally getting what I deserve," she wrote. "Should have valued me when you had the chance." Kyle immediately made her a full partner, giving her an office with her name on the door and everything. They'd post photos from the office, kissing in front of my old desk, talking about how they were going to expand the company now that the dead weight was gone. That's what they called me. Dead weight. What Jenna didn't know was that the company was hemorrhaging money. We'd taken out massive loans to expand right before COVID hit. The expansion failed spectacularly. We owed $300,000 to the bank, $200,000 to suppliers, and another $400,000 to investors who were getting ready to call in their debts. The only reason they hadn't already was because I'd been negotiating payment plans and extensions for months. But those agreements were tied to me personally remaining CEO. The second Jenna took half the company and made Kyle full CEO, all those agreements became void. Every creditor could now demand immediate payment. I'd also been covering monthly losses with my personal savings, about $30,000 a month just to keep the lights on and pay employees. The company looked profitable on paper because I'd been recording my personal investments as revenue to keep the bank from calling our loans. Technically legal if you document it right, which I had. But I stopped the second the divorce was final. Kyle had no idea how bad things really were because I'd handled all the finances. He just saw the revenue numbers and thought we were doing great. Jenna knew even less. She thought she'd won the lottery. They celebrated by buying matching luxury cars and moving into a penthouse together. All financed, of course, because their actual liquid cash was tied up in the company. 2 weeks after the divorce was final, the first creditor called. Then another. Then another. Kyle called me, panicking, asking what was happening. I explained that as a 50% owner, Jenna was now personally liable for 50% of all company debts. And as CEO, Kyle was personally liable for the other 50% since he'd signed personal guarantees to get better terms on the loans. He hadn't read those parts. The bank froze the company accounts. Suppliers started repossessing equipment. Employees quit when paychecks bounced. Within a month, creditors started coming after Jenna and Kyle's personal assets. Jenna called me screaming and asking what was happening. I kept my voice calm and walked her through it step by step. She and Kyle each owned 50% of the company now, which meant they were each personally responsible for 50% of all debts. The company owed $900,000 total to various creditors. The silence on the other end lasted about 10 seconds before she started screaming again. She called me every name she could think of and said I sabotaged everything on purpose. She said I was a monster who destroyed her life because I couldn't handle losing. She said I set this whole thing up to ruin her. I let her yell for a while before I reminded her that she was the one who demanded half the company. The judge gave her exactly what she asked for, making her a full business owner with all the legal responsibilities that come with ownership. She hung up on me after threatening to sue, which almost made me laugh. She couldn't afford a lawyer now, and any lawsuit would just add more debt to the pile she was already drowning in. An hour later, my phone rang again, and it was Kyle this time. His voice was shaking when he asked if there was any way to restructure the debt or buy more time from the creditors. I told him the truth. The creditors already gave me all the extensions they were willing to offer over the past several months. Those agreements were tied to me personally remaining CEO and having decision-making authority. The second he became CEO and I lost my position, all those agreements became void. Every creditor could now demand immediate payment, and that's exactly what they were doing. He tried to argue that there had to be something we could do, some way to fix this. I explained there was no we anymore. He was the CEO now, and these were his problems to solve. Over the next 3 days, I watched from a distance as their world fell apart in stages. The bank moved first, freezing all company accounts and beginning seizure proceedings on equipment and inventory to recover their $300,000 loan. I heard about it from a former employee who still had access to the company email system. The freeze meant Kyle couldn't pay anyone or anything. Suppliers started showing up at the office on day 2 with repo orders. I drove past the building once and saw workers loading computers and furniture onto trucks. Manufacturing equipment we'd bought just 2 years ago was hauled away on flatbeds. My phone kept buzzing with texts from former employees asking what was happening. They wanted to know if their final paychecks would clear or if they should stop payment on rent checks they'd already written. Each message made me feel a twist of guilt I wasn't expecting. These people had nothing to do with Jenna and Kyle's betrayal, but they were losing their jobs anyway. On day 4, Isabella from the bank called me directly. She needed to verify that I was no longer affiliated with the company and confirm my personal assets were protected from the seizure proceedings. She was professional and businesslike, but I could hear curiosity in her voice. She asked careful questions about how quickly everything collapsed after the ownership change. I gave her straightforward answers, and she seemed satisfied with my documentation. She mentioned that she'd been working in commercial lending for 15 years and had never seen a company implode this fast. 2 days later, Isabella called again and asked if I'd meet her for coffee. She said she wanted to explain the bank's recovery process and timeline, and she thought I deserved to understand what was happening since I'd built the company originally. We met at a coffee shop downtown, and she walked me through everything. The bank had already filed liens against Jenna and Kyle's personal assets. Their penthouse was first on the list, followed by both luxury cars they'd bought to celebrate taking over the company. Isabella explained that as listed owners and guarantors, their personal property was fair game for debt recovery. She showed me the paperwork, and I saw both their names on documents Kyle had signed without reading carefully. The personal guarantees he'd agreed to for better loan terms now meant the bank could come after everything he owned. Isabella said the bank would recover maybe 40% of what they were owed if they were lucky. The rest would be written off as bad debt, but Jenna and Kyle would still be legally responsible for it. My phone rang that evening and it was Jenna again. This time she was crying instead of screaming. She begged me to explain how this happened and what she could do to fix it. I told her the truth in detail, walking her through every single debt. I explained the $300,000 we owed the bank and the $200,000 we owed suppliers. I told her about the $400,000 investors were demanding and how I'd been negotiating payment plans for months. I described how I'd been covering $30,000 in monthly losses with my personal savings just to keep the lights on. I explained that I'd been recording those personal investments as revenue to keep the bank from calling our loans, which was technically legal as long as I documented it properly. I had documented everything. Then I stopped contributing the second the divorce was final. She went quiet, and then accused me of setting a trap. She said I deliberately hid the debt to destroy her. I pointed out that I documented everything properly and legally. Every dollar was accounted for in company records she could have reviewed any time. She demanded half the company without doing any due diligence. She never asked a single question about the actual financial state of the business. She just saw the $2 million valuation on paper and assumed she was getting something valuable. The next morning, Kyle's parents somehow got my number and called. His mother yelled at me for 10 minutes about ruining their son's life. His father said I was vindictive and cruel and that I destroyed a good man's future out of spite. I listened quietly for about 2 minutes before I interrupted. I explained calmly that their son slept with my wife for 8 months. He helped her take half my company in the divorce. Every financial obligation he was facing now was a direct result of decisions he made as an adult. He signed personal guarantees without reading them. He took over as CEO without understanding the company's finances. He celebrated his victory by buying things he couldn't afford. Those were his choices, and now he was dealing with the consequences. Kyle's father hung up on me after I finished explaining. My phone buzzed again 20 minutes later, and I almost didn't answer when I saw Matt's name on the screen. Matt was my college roommate, and one of the few people I still talked to regularly. He'd heard through mutual friends about the company falling apart, and wanted to check on me. We agreed to meet at McGinty's, a bar downtown where we used to grab drinks after work back when things were normal. I got there first and ordered a beer. Matt showed up 10 minutes later looking concerned. He ordered his own drink and we made small talk for maybe 5 minutes before he leaned forward and asked me straight out if I'd planned the whole thing. He wanted to know if I knew the debts would destroy Jenna and Kyle when they took over the company. I took a long drink from my beer and looked at him for a few seconds. Then I told him the truth. I explained that I knew exactly what would happen. I'd been holding that company together with my own money for months, covering $30,000 in losses every single month. I'd been negotiating with creditors and investors, buying time with personal guarantees and payment plans that were all tied to me staying in charge. The second Jenna got half the company and Kyle became CEO, every single one of those agreements became void. I knew the creditors would call immediately. I knew the debts would come due all at once. I knew Jenna and Kyle would be personally liable because of the ownership structure and the guarantees Kyle signed without reading them. And I stopped covering the losses the day the divorce became final. Matt sat back in his chair and didn't say anything for almost a minute. He just looked at his drink and turned the glass slowly on the table. Finally, he said he understood why I did it. Then he asked me if the revenge felt as good as I thought it would. That question hit me harder than I expected. I opened my mouth to say yes, to tell him it felt amazing watching them panic and scramble and lose everything they'd stolen from me. But the words didn't come out. I sat there staring at my beer and realized the honest answer was no. It didn't feel as satisfying as I'd expected. Watching Jenna cry on the phone should have felt like justice. Watching Kyle's parents call me in desperation should have felt like victory. But instead, I mostly felt empty and tired. I'd spent months building this elaborate trap, documenting everything, timing everything perfectly, and now I was sitting in a bar with my oldest friend wondering what I'd actually won. The company was gone. My marriage was gone. Jenna and Kyle were drowning in debt, but I was sitting alone in a cheap apartment drinking beer on a Tuesday night. Matt nodded slowly like he understood what I wasn't saying. We finished our drinks without talking much after that. 2 days later, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and a man introduced himself as Elias Bray. He said he was an attorney representing the largest group of creditors going after Jenna and Kyle. He'd gotten my contact information from Isabella at the bank. Elias wanted me to testify in their lawsuit against Jenna and Kyle. He needed me to explain the financial history of the company and confirm that all the debts existed before the ownership got transferred to them. He said my testimony would make their case much stronger for recovering personal assets from Jenna and Kyle. I agreed to help, and we set up a meeting for the next afternoon at his office downtown. I showed up at 2 o'clock, and Elias led me into a conference room with a long table covered in documents. We spent the next 3 hours going through years of financial records. I walked him through every loan, every supplier agreement, every investor contract. I showed him the payment plans I'd negotiated and the personal guarantees I'd signed. I explained how I'd been covering monthly losses with my own savings and recording those investments as revenue to keep the bank from calling our loans. Elias asked detailed questions and took notes on everything. He kept commenting on how carefully I documented everything. Every dollar was accounted for. Every transaction had receipts and records. Every agreement was filed and dated. He said my paper trail proved I'd acted completely legally, even if my timing was strategically devastating. The way he said it made me feel both vindicated and slightly sick. When we finished, Elias walked me out and thanked me for my cooperation. He said my testimony would be crucial when they went after Jenna and Kyle's remaining assets. 2 weeks after the initial collapse, I had to drive across town for a dentist appointment. The route took me past the old office building. I hadn't been back there since the day I cleaned out my desk after the divorce. I slowed down as I got close and then pulled into the parking lot. The building was completely empty. All the windows were dark. A bright orange bank seizure notice was taped to the front door. I parked my car and just sat there looking at it. The parking lot where I used to arrive at 6 in the morning to handle crisis after crisis was now just cracked asphalt with weeds growing up through the spaces. Someone had spray painted something on the side wall. A plastic bag blew across the empty lot and caught on a dead bush by the entrance. I'd spent 7 years building that company. 7 years of early mornings and late nights and missed dinners and canceled vacations. I'd poured everything into making it work, and now it was just an empty building with a seizure notice and weeds in the parking lot. Something about that hit me harder than I expected. I sat in my car for 10 minutes just staring at the building before I finally drove away. Keith reached out 3 days later through LinkedIn. He sent me a message asking if I wanted to meet for lunch. Keith had been one of my best employees, a project manager who actually understood both the technical and business sides of what we did. I agreed, and we met at a sandwich place near his new office. Keith told me he saw the collapse coming the moment Kyle took over and started making terrible decisions. He said Kyle didn't understand the business and wouldn't listen to anyone who tried to explain things to him. Keith got out 2 weeks before his last paycheck bounced. Most of the other employees stayed and got screwed when the accounts froze. We ate our sandwiches and talked about the industry for a while. Then Keith leaned forward and asked if I'd be interested in consulting on a new venture he was planning with some former colleagues. He said they were putting together a small firm focused on helping mid-sized companies with operations and financial management. He told me my financial management skills and industry knowledge were exactly what they needed. He said he wasn't bothered by the company collapse because he knew I was the one holding it together all along. Everyone who actually worked there knew Kyle was useless and that I was covering for his mistakes even before the affair. The idea of starting fresh with a new project sparked something in me that had been dead for months. I could feel actual interest and energy instead of just anger and emptiness. But I told Keith I needed time to think about it, because I was technically still dealing with the legal aftermath of everything. I was scheduled to give testimony for Elias, and I didn't know what other legal obligations might come up, but the possibility of building something new without the weight of betrayal and revenge felt unexpectedly appealing. Keith said to take my time and let him know. We shook hands and agreed to talk again in a few weeks. My phone rang 5 days later from another number I didn't recognize. I answered and heard a woman's voice say my name. It took me a second to place it. It was Jenna's sister. We'd never been close. I'd seen her maybe 10 times during the entire marriage, always at family events where we made awkward small talk and avoided each other. She asked if I had a few minutes to talk. Her voice was shaky, and I could tell she'd been crying. She said she knew I probably didn't want to hear from anyone in Jenna's family, but she was begging me to listen. She asked me to have mercy on Jenna. She said the debt was destroying her mentally and physically. Jenna wasn't eating. She wasn't sleeping. She'd lost 15 pounds in a month. She was having panic attacks every time her phone rang because it might be another creditor. Her sister said she knew Jenna had made terrible choices and hurt me badly. But despite everything, Jenna was still a human being who was suffering. She asked if there was any way I could help Jenna find a way out of the debt, or at least tell the creditors to back off a little. Her voice broke when she said she was scared Jenna might do something to hurt herself if the pressure didn't stop. I took a breath and told her I didn't create these debts, and I didn't force Jenna to demand half the company in the divorce. The consequences she was facing were direct results of her own choices, not something I did to her. Her sister stayed quiet on the other end, and I could hear her breathing getting steadier like she was trying to compose herself. But then I heard myself saying something I hadn't planned to say, that watching Jenna suffer wasn't bringing me the peace I thought it would. The words came out before I could stop them, and there was a long silence after. Her sister finally said she appreciated my honesty, and that she understood I had every right to be angry. Then she thanked me for at least listening before hanging up. I sat in my car staring at my phone for 20 minutes after that call ended, feeling something I couldn't quite name. 3 weeks later, I got the official notice about the creditors' lawsuit moving forward. They wanted my testimony in a deposition to establish the timeline of debts and ownership transfer. I showed up at the law office downtown on a Tuesday morning with 3 bankers' boxes full of financial records I'd kept from the company. The conference room had a long table, and the creditors' attorneys sat on one side while a court reporter set up her machine at the end. They swore me in and started asking questions about the company finances going back 5 years. I walked them through every loan we'd taken out, every supplier agreement, every investor contract. They asked detailed questions about my personal investments to cover monthly losses, and I showed them the documentation proving I'd been putting in $30,000 a month for almost 2 years. The attorneys wanted to know exactly when various debts were incurred versus when ownership transferred to Jenna and Kyle. I pulled out spreadsheets showing the timeline month by month, proving every single debt existed before the divorce was finalized. They asked about the payment plans and extensions I'd negotiated, and I explained how those agreements were tied to me personally remaining CEO. The deposition lasted 4 hours, and by the end I'd given them everything they needed to prove Jenna and Kyle took on existing debts they should have known about. Elias found me in the parking garage after the deposition finished. He told me my testimony was exactly what they needed, and my documentation was so thorough, it basically guaranteed they'd win judgments against Jenna and Kyle's personal assets. He said most people don't keep records this detailed, and the paper trail I'd created made their case simple. I asked how long the legal process would take, and he said probably another 2 months before they could start seizing assets to recover the debts. We shook hands, and he mentioned he was impressed by how carefully I'd protected myself legally while everything collapsed around me. I drove home feeling drained and went straight to bed, even though it was only 6 in the evening. The next morning, Matt called and asked how I was doing. I told him about the deposition, and he listened quietly before suggesting I talk to someone professional about everything that was happening. He gave me the name of a therapist named Sarah, who he said was good with complicated situations. I called Sarah's office that afternoon and got an appointment for Thursday. When I showed up, her office was in a quiet building near the university with plants in the waiting room and soft music playing. Sarah was maybe 50 with gray hair and a calm way of speaking that made me feel less defensive than I expected. We sat down and she asked me to explain why I was there. I told her about the divorce, the affair, the company collapse, all of it. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she asked me what I thought revenge would feel like versus what it actually felt like. I opened my mouth to answer and realized I didn't have a good response. I'd expected to feel satisfied, maybe even happy, but instead I mostly felt empty and couldn't sleep and kept thinking about the company, even though watching it die was exactly what I'd planned. Sarah and I met twice a week for the next month. She helped me recognize that I was grieving the company I built, even though I was the one who let it collapse. I'd spent years of my life creating something meaningful, pouring everything I had into making it work. Watching it die, even as revenge against people who betrayed me, still felt like losing a piece of myself. She asked me what the company represented beyond just a business, and I realized it was proof that I could build something from nothing, that I was capable and competent. Letting it fail to punish Jenna and Kyle meant destroying that proof, and some part of me was mourning what I'd sacrificed to get revenge. Sarah didn't tell me the revenge was wrong or right. She just helped me understand why it felt so hollow now that it was done. I was leaving therapy one afternoon when my phone started buzzing with texts from former employees and business contacts. Someone had taken a photo of Kyle's luxury car getting repossessed from the penthouse parking garage. The photo showed a tow truck loading up his expensive sedan, while Kyle stood there arguing with the repo guy. Someone had posted it online, and it was spreading through the local business community fast. Over the next 2 days, I got messages from at least 20 people, some offering sympathy, and others asking questions about what really happened with the company. A few former employees told me they'd always known Kyle was useless and weren't surprised everything fell apart after I left. I realized the business community was watching this whole collapse play out with intense interest, and people were forming opinions about who was responsible for what. The following week, I got an email from someone named Nicole Carson. She introduced herself as a bankruptcy attorney who represented clients trying to restructure failing businesses. She said she'd heard about my situation through professional contacts and thought my experience managing debt and understanding financial crisis could be valuable expertise to offer her clients. She wanted to know if I'd be interested in consulting work and mentioned she was willing to pay well for my time and knowledge. I read the email twice, surprised that anyone would want to hire me after watching my company implode, but she was right that I understood financial crisis better than most people after what I'd been through. I wrote back saying I was interested, and we set up a meeting for the next Tuesday. Nicole's office was in a modern building downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows. She was probably 40 with sharp eyes and a direct way of talking that I appreciated. We sat in her conference room and she explained that many of her clients were small business owners drowning in debt who needed help analyzing their situations and finding solutions. She thought I could review their financials, identify problems, and recommend restructuring strategies. We spent 2 hours going through a sample case, and I found myself actually enjoying the work. There was something satisfying about using my skills to help businesses survive instead of watching my own company die. Analyzing someone else's financial problems felt like solving a puzzle without the emotional weight of betrayal and revenge crushing me. Nicole offered me a contract for 10 hours a week to start, and I signed it before leaving her office. The consulting work gave me something to focus on beyond the legal aftermath of the company collapse, and I realized I needed that purpose more than I'd admitted to myself. 2 weeks later, I heard through mutual friends that Jenna and Kyle's relationship was fracturing. Someone who'd been at a restaurant downtown told me they'd had a screaming fight in public where Kyle blamed Jenna for pushing the divorce settlement that led to this disaster. He'd accused her of being greedy and destroying both their lives by demanding half the company. She'd screamed back that he was the one who convinced her she deserved it and that he'd promised they'd be rich together. The fight got loud enough that the restaurant manager asked them to leave. Other people started telling me similar stories about them fighting in parking lots and at the grocery store. Their relationship was falling apart under the pressure of the debt and legal problems, which made sense because it had been built on betrayal and fantasy about easy success. A month after that fight, Jenna moved out of the penthouse and back in with her sister. She couldn't afford rent anywhere else after the bank started garnishing her wages and seizing her accounts. Her social media went completely silent after months of posts about being a successful businesswoman and entrepreneur. I checked her profiles once and saw the last post was from 6 weeks earlier, still talking about building her empire. Now there was nothing. Part of me felt vindicated watching her lose everything she'd been so proud of taking from me. But another part just felt sad about how completely everything fell apart. How the affair and the divorce and the revenge had destroyed so many lives, including parts of my own, that I hadn't expected to lose. 3 weeks later, Elias called with an update about the legal proceedings. The bank had finalized the seizure of the penthouse, and both Jenna and Kyle were officially filing for personal bankruptcy. He explained that his clients would likely recover maybe 40% of what they were owed through the asset liquidation and bankruptcy proceedings, which meant Jenna and Kyle would still be on the hook for the remaining debt even after bankruptcy. Their wages would be garnished for years, probably a decade or more, depending on what jobs they could get with ruined credit and bankruptcy on their records. He walked me through the numbers in detail, and I listened without feeling much of anything, just processing the information like it was someone else's problem instead of the culmination of my revenge plan. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment staring at my laptop for 20 minutes, not working or browsing, just sitting there thinking about how completely their lives had been destroyed and how empty that victory felt now that it was actually happening. My next therapy session with Sarah happened 2 days later, and I found myself talking about the employees who'd lost their jobs when the company collapsed. I told her I kept thinking about the people who'd worked for me, good people who showed up every day and did their jobs, and how they got caught in the blast radius of my revenge, even though they hadn't done anything wrong. Sarah listened, and then asked me directly whether I thought those job losses were my fault or Jenna and Kyle's fault. I said it felt complicated because I didn't force Jenna to demand half the company or Kyle to sleep with my wife. But I definitely made a choice to let the company fail instead of continuing to prop it up with my personal money after they took over. She nodded and pointed out that I'd made that choice knowing what would happen, which meant I had to own the consequences for everyone involved, not just the satisfaction of watching Jenna and Kyle suffer. That session stayed with me for days afterward, making me feel guilty in ways I hadn't expected when I was planning the whole revenge scheme. Keith called me the following Tuesday, asking if we could meet for coffee to discuss the consulting venture he'd mentioned before. We met at a place downtown near his new office, and he laid out his proposal over 2 cappuccinos. He wanted to bring me on as a full partner, not just a consultant, with equal ownership stake in the new business. The focus would be helping mid-sized companies optimize their financial operations and avoid the kind of crisis situations that destroyed my old company. He'd already lined up 2 potential clients and had seed funding from a former colleague who believed in the concept. Keith said he specifically wanted me as the financial strategist because I understood debt management and crisis prevention better than anyone he knew, and he trusted me to build something sustainable instead of chasing fast growth. The offer surprised me because I'd assumed he just wanted some consulting help, not a full partnership. We spent 2 hours going through his business plan and financial projections, and everything looked solid and realistic. Nothing inflated or optimistic, just careful planning focused on building real value for clients. I told him I needed a few days to think about it, even though I already knew I wanted to say yes. Because working on something new with someone I actually trusted felt like the first real opportunity I'd had in months to build instead of destroy. I called Keith 3 days later and agreed to partner with him on the consulting venture. We spent the next 2 weeks meeting almost daily to develop a comprehensive business plan that was conservative and sustainable, learning from all the mistakes I'd made with the previous company. We focused on keeping overhead low, building steady client relationships instead of chasing big contracts, and making sure every financial decision was documented and realistic. Working on something new felt strange at first, like I'd forgotten how to think about business without the constant weight of hidden debt and revenge planning crushing me. But gradually, I started enjoying the process of creating something with clear intentions and honest projections, building a company that existed to actually help clients instead of just maintaining appearances while everything fell apart behind the scenes. Keith and I worked well together because we were both realistic about what small businesses actually needed, and neither of us had any interest in the kind of aggressive expansion that had destroyed my previous company. By the end of those 2 weeks, we had a solid business plan, initial client commitments, and a realistic timeline for growth that didn't require either of us to sacrifice our personal finances or sanity to keep things running. Matt took me out to celebrate the new venture once Keith and I had officially signed the partnership papers. We went to a nice restaurant downtown, and Matt ordered an expensive bottle of wine, saying he was proud of me for moving forward instead of staying stuck in revenge mode. He admitted he'd been worried over the past few months that I'd become completely consumed by bitterness and anger, unable to see past what Jenna and Kyle had done to me. But seeing me build something new with Keith gave him hope that I was actually going to be okay eventually, that the revenge hadn't permanently damaged my ability to trust people or believe in building something worthwhile. I told him honestly that I still felt pretty messed up about everything, that watching Jenna and Kyle's lives implode hadn't brought me the satisfaction I'd expected, and that I was struggling with guilt about the employees who lost their jobs. Matt listened and said that feeling guilty probably meant I wasn't actually a monster, just someone who'd made hard choices in an impossible situation, and that the fact I was building something new instead of just dwelling on the destruction meant I was actually processing everything in a healthy way. We talked for 3 hours that night about business and life and moving forward, and it felt good to have a friend who understood the complexity of what I'd been through without judging me too harshly for the choices I'd made. 2 days after that dinner with Matt, I got a long email from Jenna. The subject line just said, "I'm sorry," and when I opened it, I found 3 paragraphs of apology for the affair and for how she'd handled the divorce. She didn't ask for help or forgiveness or money, just said she understood now that her choices had consequences she hadn't considered when she was caught up in the affair and the excitement of taking half the company. She wrote that she'd been selfish and cruel, that she'd convinced herself I deserved to lose everything, because I'd prioritized work over our marriage, but that she could see now how she'd destroyed both our lives plus Kyle's and the employees' lives through her greed and poor judgment. The email ended with her saying she was sorry for the pain she'd caused me during our marriage, and especially after, and that she hoped I could move forward and build a good life, even though she knew she didn't deserve my forgiveness or consideration. Reading it felt surreal because for months Jenna had been screaming at me and blaming me for the financial disaster, and now suddenly she was taking responsibility and apologizing without any apparent ulterior motive. I read Jenna's email 3 times, each time trying to figure out what she actually wanted from me or what angle she was playing. But the email really did seem genuine, just an apology without any requests or manipulation. I didn't respond immediately because I had no idea what to say, or whether I even wanted to engage with her at all after everything that had happened. My next therapy session with Sarah happened 2 days later, and I brought up the email, asking her what she thought Jenna's motivation was for sending it. Sarah said it didn't really matter what Jenna's motivation was. The more important question was what I needed from Jenna at this point in my life. She asked me directly whether an apology changed anything about how I felt, or what I wanted moving forward, or if I was ready to let go of the anger that had been driving me for the past several months. I sat there thinking about that question for a long time, trying to figure out what I actually felt beyond the reflexive bitterness and suspicion. Sarah waited patiently while I worked through my thoughts, not pushing me toward any particular answer, just giving me space to process what the apology meant to me personally. After that therapy session, I spent the next few days really thinking about what I needed from Jenna, and whether holding on to my anger was actually serving any purpose anymore. The revenge had happened exactly as I planned it. The consequences had played out completely, and Jenna and Kyle were dealing with bankruptcy and garnished wages for years to come. Continuing to feel rage about the affair and the divorce wasn't changing any of that or making my life better. It was just keeping me stuck in bitterness and preventing me from fully moving forward with the new business and my own future. I realized that holding on to anger at this point was just another way of letting Jenna's betrayal control my life, keeping me focused on what she'd done instead of what I was building now. The revenge had been satisfying in a cold, technical way, watching the plan work exactly as I'd designed it, but the actual emotional satisfaction I'd expected never really materialized. What I'd gained was justice in a legal sense and consequences for people who'd betrayed me, but what I'd lost was months of my life consumed by bitterness and the ability to feel good about professional success because it was all tied up with destruction and revenge. I wrote back to Jenna a week after receiving her email, keeping my response brief and clear. I acknowledged her apology and told her I appreciated that she was taking responsibility for her choices, but I made it clear that I didn't want ongoing contact or any kind of relationship moving forward. I wrote that I hoped she found a way to rebuild her life and deal with the financial consequences of her decisions, and that I was focused on building my own future now with the new consulting business. The response felt true when I wrote it, even though I wasn't entirely sure I was actually there yet emotionally, still processing the guilt about the employees and the emptiness of the revenge. But saying I was moving forward felt like an important step toward actually moving forward, like making the statement helped create the reality I was trying to build for myself. The new consulting venture landed its first real client 3 weeks after Keith and I officially launched the business. A manufacturing company with serious cash flow problems contacted us through a referral from one of Keith's former colleagues, asking for help analyzing their finances and developing solutions before they ended up in the same kind of crisis that had destroyed my previous company. Keith and I spent 2 full days at their facility going through their books, talking to their management team, and understanding their operational challenges. Then we spent another week developing a comprehensive analysis of their problems and a realistic plan for restructuring their debt and improving their cash flow management. Working on their problems felt completely different from managing my own company's crisis because I wasn't emotionally destroyed by betrayal and revenge, just focused on solving actual business problems with clear solutions. I discovered I was genuinely good at this kind of work, when I wasn't carrying the weight of hidden debt and planned destruction, able to see financial problems clearly, and develop practical solutions that actually helped people instead of just maintaining appearances while everything collapsed. The client implemented our recommendations, and within a month their cash flow had improved enough that they could make their loan payments and start planning for sustainable growth instead of just surviving day to day. Nicole called me 2 weeks later with referrals for 2 more potential clients who needed help with financial restructuring. She told me both companies had heard about the work I did analyzing her bankruptcy cases and wanted someone who understood debt management from the inside. I met with both clients over the next week and signed contracts with each of them after presenting detailed analysis plans that showed I actually understood their problems instead of just offering generic consulting advice. The business was growing in a way that felt completely different from my old company because it was built on actual expertise and real relationships instead of the house of cards I'd been managing before. Keith and I celebrated the new contracts over lunch and started talking about office space since working from coffee shops was getting old fast. I moved into a better apartment 3 weeks later, after my lease ended on the tiny place I'd rented right after the divorce. The new apartment had 2 bedrooms, a real kitchen, and windows that actually let in natural light instead of looking out at a brick wall. Setting up the new space felt symbolic in a way I hadn't expected, like I was finally creating a life that belonged to me instead of just surviving in the aftermath of everything that happened. I bought furniture that I actually liked instead of whatever was cheapest, hung pictures on the walls, and set up a proper home office for the consulting work. The apartment wasn't extravagant or fancy, but it felt like mine in a way nothing had felt mine since before the divorce. Isabella from the bank called me one afternoon to say the company's assets had been fully liquidated and the case was closed from their perspective. The bank had recovered about 60% of what they were owed through equipment sales, and the remaining debt had been written off since Jenna and Kyle had both filed for bankruptcy. Isabella mentioned she was impressed by how I'd protected myself legally while the whole thing collapsed, keeping detailed documentation that showed I'd acted properly, even though the timing was strategically devastating for everyone else involved. She asked if I'd be interested in consulting for the bank on evaluating struggling business loans, using my experience to help them identify warning signs before companies got too deep into trouble. I took the bank consulting contract after meeting with Isabella and her supervisor to discuss the scope of work. The contract added another steady revenue stream and gave the consulting firm a professional credential that would help attract more clients down the road. Working with Isabella was straightforward and professional, just analyzing loan applications and financial statements to flag potential problems before the bank committed money to risky situations. I appreciated that she treated me as a competent expert rather than someone involved in messy divorce drama, focusing entirely on my financial skills and business knowledge instead of the personal history behind everything. The bank work was actually interesting because I could see patterns in struggling companies that reminded me of my own situation, except now I was helping prevent disasters instead of orchestrating one. 6 months after the company collapse, I ran into Kyle at a coffee shop downtown while I was meeting a potential client. He was standing in line looking exhausted and beaten down, wearing a cheap suit that didn't fit right and carrying a worn briefcase that had seen better days. Our eyes met, and we both froze for a second before he walked over with this defeated expression on his face. He told me he was working as a sales associate for someone else's company after his bankruptcy finalized, making a third of what he used to make and living in a studio apartment across town. I asked how he was doing, and he just shook his head and said he was surviving, paying off debt slowly, trying to rebuild his credit and his life. The conversation lasted maybe 30 seconds and felt awkward and final, like we both knew we'd never speak again after this, and we were just going through the motions of basic politeness. He walked away without saying goodbye, and I watched him leave feeling nothing except maybe a little sad that it had all come to this. Jenna sent me one more message months later through email since I'd blocked her number. The message was short and simple, just saying she was working as a receptionist again at a dental office and slowly paying off her debt, and that she hoped I was doing well with whatever I was doing now. I read it twice and appreciated that she wasn't asking for anything or trying to restart contact, just acknowledging that we were both moving forward in separate directions after everything that happened. I didn't respond, but I also didn't delete the message, just left it in my inbox as a kind of marker that this chapter was actually closed now. Sarah and I discussed in therapy how the revenge ultimately played out, and I admitted it was satisfying in the moment but hollow in the long term. Watching Jenna and Kyle suffer had felt like justice when it was happening, but now it just felt empty, like I'd spent all that energy on destruction instead of building something better. Sarah helped me see that I got justice in a technical sense because they faced real consequences for their choices, but that real healing came from building the new consulting business rather than from watching them struggle with bankruptcy and debt. She pointed out that I talked about the new clients and the work with actual enthusiasm, while I talked about Jenna and Kyle with just tired indifference, which showed where my energy was actually going now. The therapy sessions were helping me process the guilt about the employees who lost their jobs, and the realization that revenge didn't fix the hurt from the betrayal, it just added more pain to the situation. Keith and I hired our first employee for the consulting firm after the workload got too heavy for just the two of us to handle. We found a young financial analyst through a referral who was sharp and eager to learn, fresh out of grad school with good technical skills, but no real-world experience yet. Training someone else and building a small team felt redemptive in a way I didn't expect, like I was creating something sustainable instead of just holding together a failing company through stubborn will and personal sacrifice. The analyst asked good questions and picked things up quickly, and I discovered I actually enjoyed teaching someone the practical side of financial management that you can't learn from textbooks. Keith and I split the training responsibilities and started developing systems for how we work together as a team instead of just two guys figuring things out as we went. Matt introduced me to his cousin who works in venture capital at a networking event he dragged me to one evening. The cousin and I ended up having an interesting conversation about small business sustainability and growth strategies, and he was impressed by my practical experience managing debt and financial crisis. He mentioned that the local business association was looking for speakers for their monthly education series and asked if I'd be interested in giving a talk about managing financial problems before they become disasters. The idea terrified and excited me in equal measure because I'd never done public speaking before and wasn't sure I had anything valuable to say, but Matt encouraged me to do it and his cousin offered to help me prepare. I agreed mostly because it seemed like a good opportunity to build the consulting firm's reputation and establish myself as an actual expert instead of just the guy whose company collapsed in a divorce. I gave the speech 3 weeks later, focusing on financial management lessons learned through crisis, carefully avoiding the personal details of my divorce and company collapse. I talked about warning signs of financial trouble, strategies for managing debt, and the importance of honest assessment instead of hiding problems until they explode. The audience response was positive, and several people approached me afterward with questions about their own business situations, which made me realize I'd actually developed real expertise through the disaster I orchestrated and survived. A few people asked for my business card and mentioned they might want to hire the consulting firm for their own companies. Walking out of that event, I felt something I hadn't felt in over a year. Like I was building a professional identity based on actual competence instead of just managing catastrophe and plotting revenge. 8 months after launching the consulting firm with Keith, we hit profitability for the first time. The numbers weren't huge, but they were real and sustainable, built on actual client work instead of loans and personal money I was dumping in to keep things afloat. Keith and I sat in our small office reviewing the quarterly financials and realized we could both draw modest salaries starting next month. I'd been living off savings since the divorce, watching my bank account shrink every month, so the idea of regular income again felt almost strange after so long without it. The firm wasn't worth $2 million on paper like my old company had been, but every dollar of value was genuine, earned through competence and client results instead of hidden behind debt and desperation. Keith pulled up our client list, and we counted 15 active contracts, most of them referrals from satisfied customers who appreciated our practical approach to financial problems. We'd helped a manufacturing company restructure their supplier payments, guided a retail business through cash flow issues, and consulted on 3 bankruptcy cases for Nicole's law firm. The work was steady and growing naturally through our reputation instead of through aggressive expansion that we couldn't actually support. Nicole called me the next week with a bigger opportunity than anything we'd handled before. She wanted me to partner on a project helping a regional manufacturing group restructure their supplier relationships across multiple companies in their network. The contract was significant enough that Keith and I would need to hire 2 more consultants to handle the workload, which meant growing our team beyond just the 3 of us. I met Nicole at her office to discuss the details and scope of the project. She explained that the manufacturing group had been struggling with inconsistent supplier terms and payment schedules that were creating cash flow problems across their entire operation. They needed someone who understood both the financial side and the practical realities of managing vendor relationships under pressure. Nicole said she recommended me specifically because I had real experience navigating financial crisis and debt management, not just theoretical knowledge from business school. Sitting in her office reviewing the project proposal, I realized I was accidentally building the kind of business I'd always wanted. My old company had grown through desperation and necessity, always chasing the next client to cover existing debts, never stable enough to actually plan for sustainable growth. This consulting firm was growing because we were genuinely good at what we did, because clients valued our expertise and referred us to others who needed help. The manufacturing project would be our biggest contract yet and would establish us as serious players in the regional business consulting market instead of just 2 guys working out of a small office. I had coffee with Isabella the following week to discuss a potential long-term consulting arrangement with her bank's commercial lending division. She wanted me to help them evaluate struggling business loans and provide recommendations on whether companies could be saved through restructuring or whether the bank should cut their losses and pursue asset recovery. We met at a coffee shop near the bank's main branch, and she brought a folder full of loan files she wanted my perspective on. Isabella mentioned that my reputation in the business community had shifted significantly over the past year. She said people used to know me as the guy whose company collapsed in a messy divorce, but now they were talking about me as a financial strategist who understood crisis management and could help businesses navigate serious problems. The shift felt like unexpected redemption after months of being known primarily for the spectacular failure of my old company. Isabella explained that the bank needed someone who could assess business situations honestly and provide practical recommendations instead of just running numbers through formulas that didn't account for real-world complications. She'd been impressed by how I'd handled the documentation during my own company's collapse, how everything was properly recorded and legally sound, even though the outcome was devastating for Jenna and Kyle. The bank consulting work would provide steady income and professional credibility, another piece of building a legitimate business reputation separate from the divorce drama and revenge that had defined the past year of my life. I met with Sarah for our regular therapy session, and we discussed whether it was time to terminate our weekly appointments. She'd been helping me process the divorce, the revenge, and the complicated aftermath for almost a year now, and she thought I'd made significant progress in moving past the bitterness and focusing on building something new. Sarah said I seemed to be in a healthier place emotionally than when we started, more focused on the future, and less consumed by anger about what Jenna and Kyle had done. We talked about the guilt I still felt about the employees who lost their jobs when the company collapsed, and how I'd worked through accepting that I couldn't control all the consequences of my choices, even when those choices were legally justified. Sarah suggested occasional check-ins every few months to maintain the growth I'd achieved, instead of completely ending our therapeutic relationship. I appreciated that approach because she'd helped me navigate the darkest period of my life, those months right after the divorce when I was consumed by rage and plotting revenge while pretending everything was fine. She'd been the one person I could be completely honest with about what I was doing and why, and she'd helped me process the hollow feeling that came after the revenge succeeded, but didn't fix the hurt underneath. We agreed to move to monthly check-ins starting next month, with the understanding that I could schedule additional sessions if I needed them as I continued rebuilding my life and business. Keith brought up rebranding the consulting firm during one of our planning meetings. He thought we should develop a more professional name and website now that we were established and growing, something that positioned us as experts instead of just two guys who started a business together. We spent the following weekend working on branding materials at Keith's apartment, drinking too much coffee, and debating what we wanted the firm to represent. We settled on a name that emphasized financial sustainability and crisis management, which accurately reflected the expertise we'd developed through our own experiences and client work. Keith had some design skills from a previous job, so he mocked up logo concepts while I wrote copy for the website that explained our approach and services. We wanted to communicate that we understood business problems from the inside, that we'd lived through financial crisis, and knew how to help companies navigate serious challenges without sugarcoating the difficulty or promising easy solutions. The rebranding process felt like another step in establishing ourselves as legitimate professionals instead of just survivors of our own business disasters. We launched the new website and materials the following Monday and immediately started getting inquiries from businesses who found us through search engines instead of just through referrals. The professional presentation made us look established and credible, which opened doors that had been closed when we were just operating under a basic business name with no real marketing presence. A former employee from my old company called asking for a reference for a new job he was applying for. I hadn't talked to him since the company collapsed and employees scattered to find work elsewhere, so hearing his voice was strange and brought back memories of the office before everything fell apart. We had a good conversation where he explained that he'd landed on his feet at a competitor and was now looking to move up to a management position that required references from previous supervisors. He thanked me for being a fair boss despite everything that happened with the company collapse and the divorce drama that everyone had witnessed from the outside. He said all the employees knew Kyle was incompetent and that they weren't surprised when everything fell apart after I left. The validation felt good, even though it came months after the fact. He mentioned that several other former employees had told him they wished they'd understood what was really happening behind the scenes because they would have left earlier instead of staying until their paychecks bounced. I wrote him a strong reference letter focusing on his work ethic and skills, keeping the company collapse out of it entirely, and just highlighting what he'd contributed during his time there. After we hung up, I felt a small sense of closure about the employees who'd been caught in the aftermath of my revenge. They hadn't deserved to lose their jobs, but at least some of them had moved on to better situations and didn't seem to hold the collapse against me personally. I attended a business networking event that Matt had invited me to, one of those evening mixers where local professionals gathered to make connections and discuss potential collaborations. I found myself genuinely enjoying the conversations, instead of just going through the motions like I had at similar events in the past. Several people already knew about my consulting firm's reputation and wanted to discuss potential projects their companies might need help with. A woman who owned a chain of retail stores asked detailed questions about cash flow management and supplier negotiations. A guy who ran a small manufacturing operation wanted to know if we could help him evaluate whether to expand his facility or optimize his current space. The conversations felt natural and productive instead of forced networking, where everyone was just exchanging business cards without real interest. I realized I'd successfully rebuilt my professional identity, separate from the divorce drama and revenge that had consumed me for so long. People at this event knew me as someone who understood business finance and crisis management, not as the guy whose wife cheated with his business partner and then took half the company. The shift in how I was perceived and how I perceived myself felt significant, like I'd finally moved past defining myself through what had been done to me and started defining myself through what I was building now. Matt and I had dinner a few days later at a restaurant downtown. He commented on how different I seemed compared to 6 months ago, more relaxed and focused on the future instead of consumed by bitterness about the past. I told him he'd been right that revenge didn't feel as good as I'd expected it would. Watching Jenna and Kyle suffer through the financial collapse had been satisfying in the moment, but the satisfaction faded quickly and left me feeling empty and isolated. What actually helped me move forward was building something new, creating a business based on real competence instead of hidden debt and desperation. Matt said he'd been worried about me during the worst months after the divorce, when I was clearly planning something but wouldn't talk about the details. He'd known me long enough to recognize when I was operating from anger instead of rational thinking, but he also understood why I felt justified in letting the company collapse once Jenna and Kyle took it over. We talked about whether I'd do things differently if I could go back, and I honestly didn't know the answer. The revenge had real consequences for people who didn't deserve them, like the employees who lost their jobs. But it also freed me from a business that had been slowly destroying me through constant crisis management and personal financial sacrifice. Matt raised his glass and said he was proud of how I'd rebuilt my life and turned a terrible situation into an opportunity for genuine growth, which felt like the kind of acknowledgement I needed from someone who'd known me before everything fell apart. The consulting firm landed its biggest contract yet the following month. A national retail chain wanted us to analyze their financial operations across multiple regions and provide recommendations for improving efficiency and profitability. The project was significant enough that Keith and I needed to expand our team again, hiring 2 more consultants to handle the workload on top of the analyst we'd brought on earlier. We interviewed candidates together and found two experienced professionals who were looking for the kind of flexible consulting work we offered, instead of traditional corporate jobs. The retail chain contract represented a major milestone for the firm, proof that we could compete for serious projects against larger consulting companies with more established reputations. Keith and I celebrated by taking our small team out for a nice dinner at an upscale restaurant, acknowledging how far we'd come from two guys working out of a tiny office with no clients and uncertain prospects. Our analyst gave a toast, thanking us for the opportunity and the training we'd provided, and one of the new consultants said she was excited to be part of a growing firm that valued practical expertise over corporate politics. Sitting at that dinner table with my team, I felt genuine pride in what we'd built together, something I hadn't felt about my work in years. The old company had always been about survival and crisis management, never about actual success or sustainable growth. This consulting firm was different because it was built on solid foundations instead of hidden problems and personal sacrifice. I got an unexpected message from Jenna's sister a few days later. She thanked me for not making things worse when I could have, and said that Jenna was doing better now and slowly rebuilding her life. Jenna was working as a receptionist again, the same kind of job she'd had when we first met, and she was making regular payments on her debt obligations, even though it would take years to clear everything. Her sister said Jenna had learned hard lessons about greed and consequences, and that she'd finally stopped blaming me for everything that happened and started taking responsibility for her own choices. The message surprised me because I hadn't thought about Jenna much in recent months, too focused on building the consulting firm and moving forward with my own life. I appreciated the update and the acknowledgement that I'd eventually chosen to move forward rather than continuing to pursue revenge or make their situation worse than it already was. I could have provided testimony that would have destroyed them further in the creditors' lawsuits. Or I could have spread information through the business community that would have made it impossible for them to rebuild professionally. Instead, I just stopped engaging entirely, let the natural consequences play out, and focused on creating something new for myself. I wrote back a brief response saying I was glad Jenna was doing better and that I hoped she found stability and peace in whatever came next for her. It felt like a final closing of that chapter of my life, an acknowledgement that we'd both survived the destruction of our marriage, and the aftermath of my revenge, and that we were both moving forward separately toward whatever futures we could build from the wreckage. Nicole called 3 weeks after that message from Jenna's sister with a referral that changed the trajectory of my consulting firm. A regional healthcare company with 12 locations needed someone to analyze their financial operations and find ways to improve cash flow without cutting patient services. The CEO specifically asked for me by name after hearing about my work with Nicole's bankruptcy clients and my reputation for understanding complex financial situations. Nicole told me the CEO said he wanted someone who knew how to find real solutions instead of just making recommendations that looked good on paper. The contract was worth $60,000 for a 3-month project, easily the biggest single client we'd landed. Meeting with their leadership team felt different from earlier projects because they trusted me from the start based on my actual track record instead of just credentials or sales pitches. They'd done their research and knew I'd helped several struggling companies stabilize their finances through practical changes rather than dramatic restructuring. Working with them over those 3 months reinforced that I was genuinely good at this consulting work when I wasn't emotionally destroyed by betrayal and focused on revenge. The professional success felt satisfying in a way the revenge never did because it came from competence and helping people solve actual problems. Around the same time, I started seriously looking at houses instead of continuing to rent apartments. The consulting income was stable enough that I could afford a mortgage, and I wanted something that felt permanent and mine. I found a modest 3-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood with a small yard and a 2-car garage. Nothing fancy but solid and well-maintained, the kind of house where you could imagine actually living long-term instead of just surviving temporarily. The previous owners had kept it in good condition, and the inspection came back clean, so I made an offer that got accepted within a week. Moving in felt like a final step in rebuilding my life into something stable that belonged entirely to me. I bought a nice used car with consulting income and parked it in the garage, set up a home office in 1 bedroom, and slowly furnished the place with things I actually liked instead of whatever was cheap and functional. Setting up that house room by room over several weeks felt therapeutic in a way I hadn't expected. Each piece of furniture I chose and every picture I hung on the wall represented building something separate from the marriage and betrayal that had defined the previous chapter of my life. Keith came over to help me assemble a desk for the home office, and we ended up having a long conversation about the future direction of our consulting firm. We'd been growing steadily and had opportunities to expand faster if we wanted to, but both of us felt hesitant about chasing rapid growth after everything we'd learned. Keith said he'd watched too many companies destroy themselves by prioritizing appearances of success over sustainable business practices. I agreed completely because I'd lived that exact situation with my old company, covering losses with personal money just to maintain the illusion of profitability. We decided together that we wanted to keep the firm relatively small and focused on quality rather than trying to become a major consulting company. Our goal was building something real that helped clients solve actual problems instead of just generating revenue and impressive growth numbers. That conversation felt important because it represented both of us consciously choosing a different path based on hard lessons we'd learned. We agreed to be selective about clients and projects, to maintain work-life balance for ourselves and our team, and to build the business on solid foundations instead of debt and overextension. 2 years after the divorce was finalized, I found myself running a successful consulting firm with partners I trusted, living in a house I owned and genuinely excited about future projects and possibilities. The revenge against Jenna and Kyle had happened, and they'd faced real consequences for their betrayal and greed. Watching their world collapse had felt satisfying in the moment, but ultimately hollow in the long term. The actual healing and genuine satisfaction came from building a new life focused on competence, integrity, and sustainable success, rather than from watching them suffer through the destruction I'd orchestrated. I was happy with where I ended up, even though the path here had been darker and more complicated than I ever imagined it would be when I first discovered the affair.